Get up, soldier! We don't die standing still! Captain Darren Levain's gravelly bark cut through the chaos like a blade. He dragged a dazed lieutenant to his feet, the younger man's helmet smeared with the glimmering, ash-like residue of the Jareth psychic plague. Around them the battlefield churned, a cacophony of screams, snapping energy bolts, and alien war cries blending into a symphony of survival. The sulphurous tang of burning metal stung Darren's nostrils as the skeletal remains of an allied alien city smoldered on the horizon. Towering spires had once reached into the clouds like fingers, praying to gods that never answered, now reduced to shattered monuments by the Dominion's psychic assault. Smoke clung to the ground like a living thing, curling and slithering around boots as if seeking refuge from the carnage. Darren shoved the lieutenant toward the nearest evac skiff, its hull battered but defiant as it idled in the shadow of a fallen skyscraper. "Move, Joran, I'm not letting another man die today." Joran stumbled, clutching his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "Captain, they're gone. All of them." His voice cracked, eyes wide and unfocused. "The Tenrathi, they just collapsed. No warning, nothing left." Darren slapped him hard enough to silence the spiraling panic. "You're not Tenrathi. You're human. Keep moving." The lieutenant obeyed, his footsteps heavy and uneven as he disappeared into the smoke. Darren adjusted the grip on his sidearm and scanned the battlefield. The Tenrathi, their four-eyed allies, had fought valiantly until the Dominion's psychic plague had seeped into their minds. Now their corpses lay scattered across the ground, alien faces frozen in grotesque contortions of terror. The Jareth Dominion's power wasn't just overwhelming. It was surgical, precise, and unrelenting, and yet every human soldier was still standing. Darren's comm crackled to life, the static thick with urgency. "Command to all units. Report status. Are you still operational?" He pressed a hand to his helmet's comm port. "This is Levain. We're holding position, but the Tenrathi are down. Repeat, the Tenrathi are down. We're pulling out survivors now." "Copy that," came the reply, the clipped tone betraying controlled panic. "Are you experiencing any symptoms?" Symptoms. Darren's eyes narrowed, scanning the smoke-filled horizon as the eerie silence of the Dominion's forces settled over the battlefield. "Negative. My team's fine, physically at least." "That's impossible," the voice snapped. "The psychic plague should have—" The feed cut out with a screech, leaving only static. Darren cursed under his breath, the weight of the situation sinking in like a lead anchor in his chest. What the hell is going on? A flicker of movement drew his gaze upward. Above the battlefield, the Dominion's psychic dreadnought loomed like a malevolent star, its surface shimmering with a pale, iridescent glow. The ship emitted waves of energy, visible ripples in the air that cascaded downward like a falling tide. The plague, the weapon that had reduced entire planets to lifeless husks. And yet, Darren felt nothing. No pressure on his mind. No whispered fears clawing at the edges of his thoughts. "Levain!" Another voice, this one sharp and urgent, rang out from behind him. Orlin Myrax, a wiry intelligence officer with eyes as cold as the void, jogged toward him, his boots crunching over shattered glass and charred debris. "We need to move, now." "Tell me you've got answers, Myrax," Darren said, his tone a mix of frustration and grim humor. "Because I'm fresh out of miracles." Orlin glanced up at the psychic dreadnought, his jaw tightening. "Not answers, just theories, and you're not going to like any of them." "Try me." "The plague," Orlin began, his voice low but steady. "It targets the neural pathways of species with higher cognitive abilities, shuts them down, scrambles their minds like overloading a circuit. But humans—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "We're not reacting to it, at all. We might be immune." "Immune?" Darren's brow furrowed, his tone laced with disbelief. "How? No species is immune to Dominion tech. They've spent centuries perfecting this." "Exactly," Orlin replied, his voice hardening, "and that's why they'll come for us with everything they have. If we're immune, we're a threat to their control, a big one." The implications hit Darren like a blow to the chest. The Dominion's power wasn't just in their weapons or their fleets. It was in their ability to subjugate entire civilizations without firing a shot. Humanity's immunity wasn't just an anomaly. It was a declaration of defiance in a galaxy that thrived on obedience. "Evac skiff's ready," Orlan said, glancing over his shoulder. "But if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, we're going to need more than just a ride out of here." Darren holstered his weapon, the weight of his decision settling over him like a storm cloud. "Get the survivors to orbit. I need a line to command. If we're immune, the Dominion knows it by now, and they won't stop until Earth is ashes." Orlan nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Understood. What's the plan?" "The plan?" Darren looked out over the battlefield one last time, his gaze lingering on the fallen Tenrathi and the silent dreadnought above. "The plan is to make them regret underestimating us." As they boarded the evac skiff, the Dominion dreadnought's shimmering hull began to shift, its glow intensifying. A low, thrumming pulse rippled through the air, resonating deep in Darren's chest like the warning growl of a predator about to strike. The skiff's engines roared to life, and as it ascended through the choking smoke, Darren clenched his fists, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Yet, the evac skiff tore through the sky, its thrusters spitting streaks of molten light into the roiling darkness below. Darren Levain braced himself against the cabin wall as the violent ascent jolted him back into the seat. Every muscle in his body was coiled, his heart pounding not from the speed, but from the weight of what he'd just witnessed. The dead Tenrathi, the silent psychic assault, the immunity, it all twisted in his mind like storm currents, pulling him deeper into questions he wasn't ready to answer. From the viewport, the battlefield shrank rapidly beneath them, reduced to a patchwork of craters and burning wreckage. Above, the Dominion dreadnought loomed, its shifting glow bathing the skiff in cold, malevolent light. Darren's breath hitched as the light suddenly flared, brighter than before, illuminating the smoke-filled skies in ghostly white. "Brace!" the pilot shouted, his voice cracking through the tense cabin air. A piercing shockwave slammed into the skiff, throwing Darren and the others against the restraints. Sparks showered from overhead panels, the acrid bite of scorched wiring filling the cramped space. The vessel groaned as if protesting the onslaught, its hull trembling under the unseen force. "What the hell was that?" barked Orlan Myrax, gripping the overhead rail as he staggered toward Darren. His usually sharp composure was cracked, like a blade dulled by too many strikes. "The Dominion sending a message," Darren replied, his voice steady but edged with steel, his gaze fixed on the viewport where the dreadnought's light slowly dimmed. "They know we're watching. And they're making damn sure we know they're not done." Orlan's jaw clenched as he turned to the pilot. "How long to orbit?" 3 minutes, the pilot called back, his voice tight. "If she holds together." "She will," Darren said, his tone brooking no argument. But even as he spoke, he could feel the unspoken tension in the cabin, the kind that clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The soldiers around him were quiet, their faces drawn and pale, their thoughts likely the same as his. If humanity's immunity was real, what did it mean? And if the Dominion knew, how long did Earth have before the full weight of their wrath descended? The skiff finally breached the upper atmosphere, the fiery turbulence giving way to the vast, cold expanse of space. Earth loomed below them, a vivid blue marble scarred by the Dominion's assault. Even from here, the damage was visible. Vast swathes of scorched terrain and smoldering cities, a testament to the brutality of their new enemy. Darren tore his eyes away from the planet and turned to Orlan. "We need a secure line to command the second we dock. I want every leader, every military head, on a call within the hour." Orlan arched a brow, his skepticism cutting through the tension. "You really think they'll listen to you? Half of them can't agree on which way to tie their boots." "They'll listen," Darren said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre. "Because they don't have a choice." The skiff shuddered as it docked with the orbital station, magnetic clamps locking it into place. The hiss of decompressing air filled the cabin as the hatch slid open, revealing a sterile corridor bathed in the harsh white glow of overhead lights. Darren stepped out, his boots echoing against the metallic floor. The air here was cold and clinical, carrying the faint tang of recycled oxygen and the sharp undertone of disinfectant. "Levain," Orlin muttered as he fell into step beside him. "You really think this immunity gives us a chance?" "I think it gives us a reason to fight," Darren replied without hesitation. His tone softened slightly as he added, "The Dominion doesn't see us as equals. They see us as insects, something to crush under their boots. This immunity, it changes that. For the first time, we're not just prey. We're a problem they can't solve, and that scares them." Orlin glanced at him, his lips twitching in what might have been the ghost of a smirk. Scaring the Dominion. Now there's a thought. They reached the command center, a sprawling hub of activity where officers and analysts pored over holographic displays and streams of incoming data. The atmosphere was electric with urgency, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of reports and orders. "Commander on deck," someone called as Darren entered, drawing a brief pause before the room returned to its frenetic pace. He moved to the central display, a massive hologram of Earth surrounded by blinking red markers, each one a site of Dominion activity. "Status report," Darren demanded, his tone cutting through the noise like a whip. A young officer stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Dominion forces have pulled back from major engagement zones. It looks like they're regrouping." "Regrouping for what?" Orlin asked, his tone skeptical. "They've already proven they can wipe us out without breaking a sweat." "Not all of us," Darren said quietly, his gaze fixed on the hologram. He turned to the officer. "Get me a secure channel to every global leader. Now." The officer hesitated, then nodded and hurried off to comply. Darren took a deep breath, his fingers drumming against the edge of the display table as he considered his next move. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a physical force, but he couldn't afford to show it. Not here. Not now. "You're really going to try to unite them," Orlin said, leaning against the table with a faint smirk. "The politicians, the generals, the corporate heads. You're going to pull them all into one room and convince them to play nice." Darren shot him a look. "You have a better idea?" "No," Orlin admitted, his smirk fading. "But I hope you know what you're doing. If they turn on each other, the Dominion won't even need to finish the job." "They won't turn," Darren said firmly, "because I won't let them." The secure channel was established within minutes, the holographic display shifting to show a mosaic of faces, presidents, prime ministers, generals, and CEOs, their expressions ranging from grim determination to barely concealed panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Darren began, his voice steady and commanding, "I'll make this brief. You've all seen what the Dominion is capable of, and you've all seen what they tried to do to us today. But here's the thing, they failed. Their plague didn't touch us. Not a single human fell. That's not a coincidence. That's an opportunity." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We're immune to their greatest weapon. That makes us a threat, and threats get eliminated. The only way we survive is by standing together. Not as nations, not as corporations, as one species. Because make no mistake, the Dominion is coming, and they won't stop until Earth is ashes." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of machinery in the background. Then slowly, one by one, the faces on the display began to nod. Darren straightened, his jaw set with determination. "Good. Then let's get to work." As the call ended and the room began to buzz with renewed purpose, Orlin stepped closer, his voice low. "You really think we can pull this off?" Darren's gaze remained fixed on the hologram, his eyes hard and unyielding. "We don't have a choice." The room pulsated with restless energy as the mosaic of leaders dissolved from the screen, leaving the command center eerily quiet except for the relentless flicker of holographic displays. Darren stepped away from the table, his boots clicking against the steel floor. His movements were deliberate, measured, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the storm brewing within. He clenched his fists briefly, then released them, exhaling through his nose like a pressure valve about to burst. Orlin followed silently, his eyes darting between the monitors and the personnel scrambling to make sense of the unfolding chaos. "We've bought ourselves time, but not much. The Dominion isn't regrouping for long. They're testing us, probing for weaknesses. They'll find none, Darren replied without looking back, his voice sharp enough to cut through Orland's skepticism. He stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on a hologram depicting the solar system. Red markers, like bloodstains, hovered around Earth's orbital defenses, failing stations, obliterated satellites, and the gaping holes left by Dominion strikes. Beyond them, Jupiter gleamed ominously, its swirling storms a cosmic sentinel in the distance. The Dominion fleet's position was marked there, clustered like vultures circling prey. A technician's nervous voice broke the silence. "Sir, we've got partial telemetry from the outer probes. There's movement near the asteroid belt, multiple signatures, Dominion ships. They're repositioning." Darren leaned over the console, studying the shifting data with predatory focus. "They're not repositioning," he murmured. "They're encircling." Orland frowned, stepping closer. "A blockade?" "No," Darren said, straightening. "They're laying a trap. They want us to think they're pulling back to regroup, but they're corralling us into a kill zone." His fingers hovered over the hologram, tracing the paths of the Dominion ships. "They're cutting off potential escape routes while keeping their psychic weapon in range. They don't need to rush. They know we're scrambling." "Then we need to be faster," Orland said. "What's the move?" Darren's eyes narrowed, his mind spinning through possibilities like a wheel with too many spokes. He tapped a point on the hologram, a relay station near Europa, still broadcasting weak telemetry. "We send a decoy fleet here, make them think we're planning a counterattack. It'll force them to reposition and buy us time to reinforce orbital defenses." Orland crossed his arms, his voice laced with doubt. "That's assuming they take the bait, and even if they do, they'll realize it's a diversion the moment we don't follow through." "That's why we make it look real," Darren said, turning to one of the officers nearby. "Pull together every drone, every automated ship we have left. Outfit them with EMP charges and send them on a collision course for Europa. Make it messy, make it convincing. We'll broadcast false comms traffic to sell the illusion." The officer hesitated, then nodded and moved to relay the orders. Orland shook his head, a wry smirk tugging at his lips. "You're playing chicken with the Dominion." "Better than letting them think we're running scared," Darren replied, his tone as sharp as a blade. "And while they're chasing ghosts, we'll make our real move." "Which is?" "Jupiter," Darren said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "They've concentrated their forces there for a reason. Whatever they're protecting, we need to destroy it." Orland's smirk faded. "That's a suicide run." "Not if we're smart about it," Darren said, already moving toward the tactical planning station. "We send a strike team to disable their fleet's command hub while the rest of us hold the line. If we cut the head off the snake, the rest will scatter." Orland followed, his skepticism simmering beneath the surface. "And who exactly is volunteering for this glorious mission?" Darren didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened as he tapped commands into the console, bringing up schematics of Dominion ships and the positions of Earth's remaining forces. Finally, he glanced at Orland, his expression hard. "I'll lead it." "Of course you will," Orland muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "Why am I not surprised?" Before Darren could reply, the tactical display blinked, an alert flashing in angry red. The technician who'd spoken earlier looked up, his face pale. "Sir, we've got new data from the probes. It's worse than we thought." The room seemed to hold its breath as the technician brought up the feed. The hologram shifted, zooming in on Jupiter's orbit. Dozens of Dominion ships were clustered there, their sleek alien designs gleaming like predatory fish circling a reef. But it wasn't the ships that drew everyone's attention. It was the massive construct at the center of the formation. A spire of obsidian black metal rose from the planet's swirling storms, its surface pulsating with veins of faint, otherworldly light. The structure radiated a sense of dread, its sheer presence almost suffocating. "What the hell is that?" Orland whispered, his voice barely audible. Darren's stomach churned as he stared at the construct. It looked ancient, far older than anything the Dominion had ever deployed. "Their command hub," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "Or something worse." The technician hesitated, then added, "Sir, preliminary scans indicate the structure is emitting low-frequency psychic waves. It's It's amplifying them. Of course it is, Orlin said bitterly. Because wiping out entire species with a thought wasn't enough. They needed to supercharge it. Darren ignored him, his focus laser-sharp. How long until they bring it online? The technician shook his head. Unknown, but if they do... They won't, Darren said firmly, cutting him off. He turned to Orlin, his voice low but filled with quiet intensity. Prep the strike team. I want a full briefing in an hour. We're taking that thing out. Orlin's gaze lingered on him, a mixture of respect and frustration flickering in his eyes. You really think we can pull this off, don't you? Darren didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the hologram, the construct's ominous glow reflecting in his steely gaze. We don't have to destroy their whole fleet, he said finally. We just have to send a message. And what message is that? Orlin asked. That we're not going down without a fight, Darren said, his tone cold and unyielding. And if they want to take us, they're going to bleed for it. As the command center erupted into activity around them, Darren turned back to the hologram, his mind already racing with the details of the mission. The Dominion thought they had humanity cornered, but they didn't realize they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. He just hoped they wouldn't figure it out until it was too late. The room's charged energy hummed in Darren's ears as the command center buzzed with movement. He could feel the urgency around him as officers barked orders and technicians scrambled to sift through the latest intelligence. Yet, his mind remained locked on the hologram of the Dominion's ominous construct orbiting Jupiter, its pulsating glow seared into his thoughts like an open wound. It wasn't just a target, it was a warning. We've got 30 hours at most before they deploy that thing, Orlin said, his voice low but carrying an edge of concern as he fell into step beside Darren. And that's if we're lucky. Darren nodded absently, his jaw tightening. Then we don't waste a second. Good plan, Orlin replied dryly, gesturing toward the chaotic room. But how exactly do you suggest we take out a psychic amplifier surrounded by an armada? Throw rocks at it until it gives up? Darren stopped abruptly, turning to face him. His gaze was hard, cutting. We dig. Orlin blinked. Dig? Antarctica, Darren said simply. There's a buried facility there, pre-Federation tech. If the archives are right, it holds an automated defense network, railgun satellites, orbital disruptors, the works. It hasn't been active in centuries, but if we can wake it up, then we might stand a chance, Orlin finished, his tone skeptical but intrigued. Assuming it's not completely degraded or booby-trapped. We don't have the luxury of assuming anything else, Darren said, already walking toward the briefing room. Prep the strike team. We leave in 2 hours. The icy winds of Antarctica howled like a living thing, battering the team as they descended from the dropship. Darren tightened his thermal suit around his neck, the biting cold slicing through the layers like knives. Snow lashed at his visor, reducing the world to a disorienting blur of white. Behind him, Orlin and the others moved in a tight formation, their silhouettes barely visible against the endless expanse of ice. You sure about this, Levain? Orlin called, his voice muffled by the gusts. Because I've got frostbite already, and we've been here for 5 minutes. Keep moving, Darren replied, his tone firm. The entrance is just ahead. The team trudged forward, their boots crunching against the hardened snow. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, as if the frozen ground were resisting their intrusion. Darren could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, heavier than the layers of frost accumulating on his shoulders. They were walking into the unknown, guided only by faded blueprints and faint signals from an ancient beacon buried beneath the ice. Finally, the silhouette of a jagged structure emerged from the storm, a dark, angular shape jutting from the glacier like the blade of a buried sword. Darren's breath caught as they drew closer, the scale of the facility becoming clear. Its exterior was blackened and weathered, the material unlike anything modern engineering could replicate. Veins of faint blue light pulsed intermittently along its surface, flickering like the heartbeat of a long, dormant giant. This is it, Darren said, his voice tinged with both awe and relief. The Egis facility. Lovely name, Orlin muttered. eyeing the structure warily. Let's just hope it doesn't decide to kill us the second we step inside. The entrance was a heavy triangular door embedded with ancient symbols that glowed faintly as Darren approached. He placed a hand on the cold, unyielding surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like grinding stone, the door began to shift, splitting down the middle and sliding apart to reveal a dark corridor descending into the depths. "Stay alert," Darren ordered, drawing his sidearm as he stepped into the void. The air inside was stale and metallic, carrying an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The corridor was narrow, the walls lined with faintly glowing conduits that pulsed rhythmically, illuminating their path with ghostly light. Each step echoed ominously, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung over them like a shroud. "This place gives me the creeps," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Orlin replied tersely. "Means you'll stay on edge." They descended deeper, the air growing heavier with every step. The corridor eventually opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, the symbols glowing faintly as if reacting to their presence. At the center of the room stood a massive console, its surface embedded with countless interfaces and displays that flickered erratically. Darren approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He placed a hand on the console, the surface cool and unyielding. For a moment nothing happened. Then the room came alive. Lights flared to life along the walls, illuminating the chamber in stark, brilliant clarity. The carvings pulsed with energy, their glow intensifying until they seemed to radiate heat. A low, resonant hum filled the air, not of machinery, but of power awakening after centuries of slumber. "Welcome, Administrator," a voice intoned, deep and mechanical, yet strangely human. The words reverberated through the chamber, carrying an almost tangible weight. "The Aegis protocol is ready to serve." Orlin stepped forward, his expression a mix of amazement and suspicion. "Did it just call you Administrator?" "Looks like it," Darren replied, his tone grim. "Let's hope that means it's willing to cooperate." "State purpose," the voice continued, its tone devoid of emotion. "Directive required for reactivation." Darren hesitated, then spoke clearly. "Reinstate planetary defense grid. Prioritize targets. Dominion fleet. Secondary directive. Prepare for full-scale activation." The console pulsed, its displays flickering as the system processed his command. "Warning. Planetary defense grid integrity compromised. Repair protocols initiated. Estimated operational capacity, 60%. "That'll have to do," Darren muttered. "Bring it online." The room shuddered as the Aegis protocol activated. A deep vibration rippled through the ground, resonating in their chests. Holographic displays flared to life, showing schematics of ancient weapon systems scattered across Earth's orbit. One by one, they began to flicker online, their dormant power reawakening like sleeping giants stirred from their slumber. Orlin whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. It actually works." "Don't celebrate yet," Darren said, his gaze fixed on the displays. "We've still got a war to fight." The Aegis voice returned, its tone as steady as ever. "Warning. Unauthorized interference detected. Dominion presence within range. Defensive measures required." Darren's stomach dropped. "They know we're here." As if on cue, the ground trembled violently, dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. The distant sound of explosions echoed through the facility, growing louder with each passing second. "They're coming," Orlin said, drawing his weapon. "And they're not knocking politely." Darren turned to the team, his voice sharp and commanding. "Hold the entrance. We can't let them take this place." The team moved swiftly, taking up defensive positions as the first shockwave rattled the chamber. Darren clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They had activated the Aegis protocol, but now they had to protect it, and themselves, long enough to make it matter. The tremors came again, more violent this time, cascading through the subterranean chamber like the pulse of a dying planet. Dust rained from the vaulted ceiling, settling in thin, pale layers over the glowing carvings that danced along the walls. Darren braced himself against the console, the ancient surface trembling under his hands. Every muscle in his body tensed as the realization hit him. This wasn't a small-scale attack. The Dominion was throwing its full weight at them now. "They're breaching the outer perimeter!" Orlan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He stood at the entrance, his weapon raised, his eyes locked on the flickering live feed displayed on his forearm console. Bright bursts of light erupted across the screen as Dominion assault teams clashed with the outer defenses. "Hold the line," Darren barked, spinning to face the team. "We're not losing this facility." The distant roar of explosions sent vibrations rippling through the ground beneath their boots. A metallic taste lingered in the air, sharp and cold, mixing with the faint sting of charged particles from the defense grid reactivating. The entire room felt alive now, as if the Aegis protocol itself was awakening in response to the encroaching threat. The first wave hit like a storm. Dominion shock troopers encased in blackened exosuits that pulsed faintly with violet energy swarmed into the corridor. Their presence was oppressive, each movement deliberate, their suits emitting a rhythmic, unnatural pulse that reverberated in the ears of the defenders. "Contact!" one of the soldiers yelled, opening fire. The air filled with the shriek of plasma rounds and the sharp retort of human railguns, the weapons kicking against their operators with bone-jarring force. Sparks danced across the metallic walls, and the corridor lit up in rapid bursts of blinding light, painting the battlefield in flashes of chaos. Orlan cursed as he fired, his precision unmatched even under the onslaught. A Dominion trooper collapsed, its exosuit sparking violently as it crumpled to the ground. "Levain, we can't hold this position forever. They're going to overwhelm us." Darren didn't answer immediately. His focus was split between the Aegis system's readouts and the crumbling state of their defenses. The schematics glowed before him, showing the slow but steady reactivation of Earth's orbital weaponry. It wasn't fast enough. "Get the sentry drones online," he said, his voice taut. "Buy us time." Orlan ducked behind a support pillar as another explosion rocked the room, fragments of stone and metal spraying like shrapnel. "They'll be drawn here the second we activate them." "Let them come," Darren growled. "We need those drones now." The soldier beside Orlan, a wiry man named Joran, moved to the console on Darren's order. His fingers flew across the ancient interface, sweat beading on his brow despite the biting chill of the room. "Initializing sentry drones," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "Systems lagging. Might take a minute." Darren's gaze flicked to the corridor, where the team held their ground against the relentless wave of Dominion troops. He could feel the weight of every second slipping away, each one pulling them closer to the edge. "Hold steady!" he shouted, striding toward the line. He crouched beside a young soldier, barely more than a kid, who was reloading with shaking hands. Darren grabbed his shoulder, meeting his terrified gaze. "Breathe. Focus. They're not invincible." The soldier nodded, his movements becoming steadier. He snapped the magazine into place and resumed firing, his shots finding their marks with newfound precision. A piercing, guttural sound echoed from deeper within the corridor, a sound that sent a chill racing down Darren's spine. It was alien, otherworldly, a distorted resonance that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. The Dominion's second wave was coming. "Brace yourselves!" Darren shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. The first of the second wave appeared, and Darren's stomach turned. These were no ordinary troops. Their suits were larger, more angular, with jagged protrusions that glowed a sickly violet. Their movements were unnervingly fluid, as if the suits themselves were alive, guiding their hosts. The air around them seemed to distort faintly, the psychic energy they emitted creating a tangible pressure that pressed against the defenders. "They've brought psionics," Orlan hissed, his tone dripping with venom. Darren raised his rifle, his mind racing. "Focus fire on the psionics. Keep them off balance." The air grew heavier, the psychic energy radiating from the Dominion forces like a crushing tide. Darren's vision blurred for a moment, a faint ringing filling his ears, but he forced himself to push through it. He squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming into his shoulder as his shots tore into one of the psionic troopers. Its shield shimmered violently before collapsing, and the suit crumpled to the ground in a heap. "Joran!" Darren yelled over the cacophony. "Where are those drones?" "Coming online now!" Joran called back, his voice laced with desperation. He slammed a final command into the console, and the room shuddered as hidden compartments along the walls slid open. Sleek, insect-like drones emerged, their surfaces gleaming with a metallic sheen as they powered up. Without hesitation, they launched toward the enemy, their mounted weapons erupting in precise deadly bursts. The drones cut through the Dominion ranks like surgical instruments, their weapons carving paths through the advancing troops. But even as the tide began to shift, Darren knew it wasn't enough. The psionics were adapting, their shields growing stronger with each moment, and the relentless waves of reinforcements showed no signs of slowing. "We're not holding this position much longer," Orland said grimly, ducking behind cover. "We need a fallback plan." "We don't fall back," Darren replied, his tone ironclad. He fired another volley, his jaw set as he watched one of the psionics stumble and collapse. "We hold this line, or everything we've done is for nothing." The words hung in the air, a challenge as much as a declaration. The soldiers around him stiffened, their resolve hardening as they continued to fight with renewed vigor. Darren could feel the shift, the intangible weight of their desperation transforming into something sharper, more focused. But then the floor beneath them trembled violently, a deep guttural rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Dominion wasn't stopping, they were escalating, and the fight was far from over. The ground shivered with a relentless fury, each tremor stronger than the last, as though the facility itself was groaning under the strain of holding back the Dominion onslaught. Dust spiraled downward from cracks forming in the ceiling, the air thick with the biting tang of ionized metal and the faint heat of scorched plasma. Darren wiped a streak of sweat and grit from his forehead, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip on his rifle. The Dominion wasn't retreating. They were tunneling through the rock beneath them. "They're breaching from below." Orland's voice was a sharp crack in the din, rising above the muffled booms of explosives and the unrelenting whir of the sentry drone's weapons. He stood near the edge of the corridor, his sharp features lit by the strobing fire of the drones slicing through the advancing troops. "They're trying to collapse the facility." "Let them try," Darren said, his voice rough but steady. He slammed another magazine into his rifle, his eyes never leaving the twisted, violet-armored forms of the Dominion forces still pouring into the corridor. "We're not giving up this ground." "You're an optimist, Levain," Orland said, firing off a shot that dropped a Dominion trooper mid-charge. "But this isn't ground. It's a coffin waiting to be sealed." The words hit hard, though Darren didn't let it show. He refused to entertain the weight of them, not now. The facility's schematics burned in his mind, an intricate web of interconnected systems with Egis at the center. The Dominion wasn't just after their position. They wanted control of the protocol itself. And if they got it, Earth wouldn't just lose the fight. They'd lose the war. Joran's voice cut through the chaos, raw and strained. "We've got seismic spikes under the northeast quadrant. They're forcing their way through the sublevels." Darren moved to the console, the holographic interface flickering under his touch. The seismic readouts were clear. Dominion shock teams were boring directly into the facility's vulnerable underbelly. It wasn't just a breach, it was precision sabotage, designed to sever Egis from its control systems. "They're going for the main relay," Darren muttered, the realization sharpening his focus. He turned to Orland. "We can't let them get to sublevel 5. If they cut that relay, it's over." "You mean we're over," Orland corrected, his eyes narrowing. "And here I thought you wanted to retire somewhere warm." Darren smirked faintly, though the edge in his voice didn't soften. "Warm is overrated. Get a team to the sublevels. I'll hold the line here." "Alone?" Orland said, his tone incredulous. "That's a bold way of saying suicide." "Then stay and help," Darren shot back. "But if we lose that relay, the surface defenses go offline and we're done." Orland hesitated, then nodded curtly. "You're impossible. You know that?" It's why you keep me around, Darren said, turning back to the line of defenders. Joran, you're with me. Get explosives prepped for the main corridor. We'll bottleneck them here. Joran nodded, his hands moving quickly as he began pulling charges from his pack. The young soldier's movements were mechanical, his focus razor-sharp despite the terror flashing in his eyes. Yes, sir. The ground beneath them heaved violently, nearly knocking Darren off his feet. A deafening crack tore through the air as a section of the wall buckled inward, exposing jagged rock and a fresh wave of Dominion troops pouring through the breach. Their armor gleamed with an unnatural sheen, their movements unnervingly synchronized as they advanced, weapons firing in bursts of violent light. Fall back to the secondary line, Darren roared, his voice commanding even as adrenaline surged through his veins. The defenders moved quickly, their boots pounding against the metal floor as they repositioned behind makeshift barricades. Joran set the final charge near the breach, his face pale but resolute. Charges are live. We'll have to detonate manually. Then you'd better move fast, Darren said, covering the soldier as he retreated. The Dominion pressed forward, their assault relentless, and Darren's rifle kicked hard against his shoulder as he fired shot after shot into the advancing wave. Detonating! Joran yelled, his hand slamming down on the remote. The corridor erupted in a blinding flash, the shockwave tearing through the Dominion ranks and sending chunks of debris raining down. The air turned hot, the acrid bite of scorched stone and metal filling their lungs. For a moment silence fell, broken only by the distant rumble of collapsing rock. Good work, Darren said, his tone clipped as he moved back toward the console. But they'll send more. They always do. Before Joran could respond, the comm crackled to life, Orland's voice cutting through the static. Levain, we've got a problem. We're drowning in problems, Myrax, Darren replied, scanning the updated schematics. Be more specific. There was a pause, heavy with something unspoken, and when Orland spoke again, his voice was cold. It's Ixon. Darren froze, the name hitting him like a blow. What about him? He's not who we thought he was, Orland said, his voice low. We caught him transmitting to the Dominion. He's been feeding them our locations. The words were a knife twisting in Darren's gut. Marl Ixon, the man he'd trusted to coordinate supply lines and reinforce their defenses, had betrayed them. The sudden clarity of it all was suffocating. Every ambush, every perfectly timed Dominion strike, it all led back to him. Where is he now? Darren asked, his voice ice. On his way to you, Orland said, and he's not coming to apologize. Darren slammed the console, his frustration boiling over. Damn it! He turned to Joran. Hold this position. No one gets through. What about you, sir? Joran asked, his eyes wide. Darren's expression darkened, his resolve hardening. I've got unfinished business. He left the barricade, his steps purposeful, his rifle slung across his back. The facility's labyrinthine corridors stretched ahead, dimly lit and ominously quiet. Every sound, every distant crack, every faint vibration set his nerves on edge. Betrayal always cut the deepest, and Darren could feel the wound tearing wider with every step. He found Ixon near the facility's central relay, his silhouette cast in harsh relief by the pulsing glow of the control console. The man turned as Darren approached, his face a mask of calm indifference. You're late, Ixon said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. Drop the act, Darren growled, his weapon aimed squarely at Ixon's chest. How much did they pay you? Ixon's lips curled into a faint smile. Pay? You think this was about money? Then what? Darren demanded, his finger tightening on the trigger. Power? Revenge? Ixon's smile faded, replaced by something colder. Survival. You don't see it, do you? We've already lost. The Dominion isn't just stronger. They're inevitable. Fighting them is suicide. Maybe, Darren said, his tone low and lethal. But I'd rather die standing than live on my knees. Ixon's eyes narrowed. You're a fool. And you're a traitor, Darren snapped. He fired, the shot echoing through the chamber. Ixon crumpled, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Darren lowered his weapon, his breath steady despite the pounding in his chest. Darren stood over Ixon's body, the faint glow of the relay casting long shadows on the floor. The air was heavy with the sterile electric tang of the console's energy field. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging slightly in the frigid atmosphere of the facility. Time was slipping through his fingers like water, and the betrayal gnawed at him with every passing second. The comm in his ear crackled to life. Orlan's voice was sharp and to the point. "Levain, the Dominion is making their final push. We've lost contact with the outer defense points. If we don't stop them here, it's over." Darren glanced at the pulsing relay behind him, the faint vibration of its reactivation humming through his boots. It was coming online, but not quickly enough. He pressed a hand to his comm. "Orlan, get the team back to the core. I have a plan." "We're barely holding the line as it is," Orlan shot back. "What's this brilliant plan of yours?" "We're going to trap them," Darren said, his tone clipped. "I need you to reroute all auxiliary power to the facility's coolant vents and overload the conduits near the main breach point. If we time it right, we can collapse the entire lower quadrant on their forces." "Overloading the coolant vents could fry the core," Orlan replied, his voice laced with doubt. "It's a risk we have to take," Darren said, already moving toward the control console. The floor beneath him quaked again, a dull roar echoing through the chamber as another Dominion assault wave pushed forward. "We don't have time for a debate." Orlan's pause was brief, but heavy. "Fine. But if this fails, I'm blaming you." Darren allowed himself a faint smirk. I'd expect nothing less. He reached the console, his fingers flying over the holographic interface. The schematics of the facility filled the screen, its intricate network of conduits and chambers glowing in vibrant reds and blues. He traced the paths with his eyes, identifying the weak points that would force the Dominion into a bottleneck. Joran's voice came over the comm, strained but steady. "Sir, we're taking heavy fire at the second line. We've got wounded." "Pull back to the relay chamber," Darren ordered. "We're setting a trap, but we need every man still standing." "Understood," Joran replied. The faint echo of gunfire and the sharp hiss of plasma bolts underscored his words before the line cut out. Darren's eyes remained fixed on the schematics as he calculated the timing. The coolant vents were old, their systems unstable from centuries of disuse. Overloading them would create a controlled collapse, but it would also destabilize the facility's structural integrity. The margin for error was razor thin. Orlan's voice cut back in. "I'm at the coolant controls. Rerouting power now. You'd better be right about this." "I'm right," Darren said firmly. "Once you're done, get back here. We'll need to coordinate the timing." The vibrations in the floor intensified, each quake sending small clouds of dust cascading from the ceiling. The Dominion was getting closer. Darren could feel the tension building, the air charged with anticipation like the moments before a storm. The faint sound of distant explosions reverberated through the walls, a grim reminder of how close they were to the brink. Orlan's voice returned, this time strained. "Coolant vents are set to overload. Conduits are primed. You'll have about 10 seconds to trigger the collapse once they breach the main corridor." "Plenty of time," Darren said, his tone dry. "Get back here, Orlan." "On my way," Orlan replied, his voice fading as the comm went silent. Darren stepped back from the console, his gaze shifting to the soldiers regrouping in the relay chamber. Their faces were a mixture of exhaustion and determination, their weapons ready, their stances firm. He could see the weight of the fight in their eyes, the grim acceptance of what was coming. "Listen up," Darren called, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. The soldiers turned toward him, their attention unwavering. "The Dominion thinks they've got us cornered. They think this is the end, but they don't know what we've got waiting for them." He gestured to the relay, its pulsing light casting eerie shadows across the room. "This facility isn't just a relic. It's our lifeline, and we're going to use it to remind them that humanity doesn't roll over. We fight." The soldiers straightened, their resolve solidifying. Orlan arrived moments later, his expression as sharp as ever. "Everything's ready, just say the word." "Let's finish this," Darren said, his tone cold and final. The first signs of the Dominion's breach came moments later, a deep guttural rumble that seemed to roll through the facility like thunder. The lights flickered, the air thick with tension as the defenders braced themselves. "They're coming," Joran said, his voice tight. "Hold your positions," Darren ordered. He moved to the edge of the chamber, his rifle raised as the first Dominion shock troopers appeared. Their blackened armor gleamed in the flickering light, their movements precise and deliberate. The corridor filled with the shriek of plasma rounds and the sharp bark of railgun fire as the battle erupted. The air was hot with energy, the metallic tang of spent rounds and scorched surfaces filling Darren's lungs. The Dominion pressed forward relentlessly, their psychic troopers amplifying their forces' movements with unnatural coordination. The defenders fought with everything they had, their shouts mixing with the deafening roar of weapons fire. "Orlan, now!" Darren shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Orlan slammed his hand down on the control panel, triggering the coolant vent overload. A deep, resonant vibration shook the chamber as the conduits beneath the facility erupted. The floor quaked violently, the sound of collapsing rock and metal deafening as the Dominion forces were engulfed in a wave of destruction. The defenders fell back, the heat of the collapse searing their faces as they retreated to the far end of the chamber. Dust and debris filled the air, the world a blur of chaos and noise. When the shaking subsided, the room fell eerily quiet. The Dominion's advance had been stopped, their forces crushed beneath the facility's lower levels. Darren stood at the edge of the destruction, his breath heavy, his body aching from the fight. But there was no relief, no victory. The battle wasn't over, not yet. He turned to Orlan, his expression grim. "They'll be back." "And we'll be ready," Orlan replied, his tone unwavering. Darren nodded, his gaze shifting to the relay. It was still online, its pulsing light a faint beacon in the darkness. The facility had held, for now, but the fight for humanity's survival was far from finished. The air in the relay chamber hung heavy with tension, thick with the sharp tang of scorched metal and the faint bite of static energy. Dust swirled lazily through the dim light as Darren stood motionless, his rifle resting loosely in his hands. Around him the team was battered but unbroken, their eyes betraying the weight of exhaustion and determination. The Dominion might have slowed, but the fight was far from over. Darren turned back to the relay console, its faint glow casting his face in sharp relief. The schematics of the orbital platforms above Earth flickered on the display, their power surging as Egis worked tirelessly to bring them online. Each second felt like an eternity, every breath heavy with anticipation. The amplifier orbiting Jupiter, an artifact of pure Dominion supremacy, was still out there, casting its ominous shadow across the battle. "Status report," Darren ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. Orlan leaned against the wall, one arm pressed to his side where his suit had been scorched during the earlier skirmish. "Coolant systems are stabilizing, and the drones bought us some breathing room. But their fleet isn't going anywhere. Reinforcements will be here soon." "They'll hit us harder next time," Joran added from his station, his voice edged with unease. "We can't hold the facility against another wave like that." Darren's eyes narrowed as he studied the display. "We're not waiting for them to hit us again. We take the fight to them." Orlan snorted faintly, his expression one of disbelief. "Take the fight to them? With what exactly? Spit and prayers?" "With everything we've got," Darren shot back, his voice hard. "The orbital platforms are almost fully operational. Once they're aligned, we focus their fire on the amplifier. We don't just disrupt their psychic network, we tear it apart." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the room. Joran glanced nervously at the schematics. "Even if we take out the amplifier, their fleet will retaliate. That's assuming we can even get through their defenses." "That's why we hit 2 targets," Darren said, stepping closer to the display. "While the platforms focus on the amplifier, we use the surface disruptors to carve a path through their fleet. Their command ship is the backbone of this assault. Take it out, and the rest of their forces fall apart." Orlan's sharp gaze flicked to Darren. "You're betting everything on ancient tech that barely works." "It's all we've got," Darren replied, his tone unyielding. "And it's more than they're expecting." The room fell silent again, the sound of distant tremors and settling debris filling the void. Orlin studied Darren for a moment longer before letting out a resigned sigh. "You're a madman, Levain. But fine. Let's see if we can pull off a miracle." Darren allowed himself the faintest flicker of a smile. "Prep the team. We synchronize the platforms and the disruptors. Timing is everything." The next hour was a blur of preparation. Joran worked tirelessly at the relay console, calibrating the targeting systems while Orlin coordinated the remaining drones for maximum disruption. The air was thick with urgency, every movement purposeful as the team moved like a single organism, their exhaustion overshadowed by sheer resolve. Darren stood near the relay, watching the orbital platforms slowly align on the holographic display. Their ancient mechanisms groaned to life, power levels surging as Egis routed every available resource into their activation. The amplifier above Jupiter loomed on the screen, its pulsating light casting a menacing glow. "They'll retaliate the second we fire," Orlin warned as he approached. "This isn't just a strike, it's a declaration of war." "It's survival," Darren replied, his voice low. "And we don't have a choice." Joran's voice broke in, steady but strained. "Platforms are locked. Targeting systems are synced. We're ready on your command." Darren stepped forward, his hand hovering over the console's final activation command. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he didn't falter. His voice was steady as he gave the order. "Fire!" The orbital platforms erupted, their beams of searing energy converging on the amplifier. The distant construct writhed under the assault, its dark surface fracturing as the concentrated firepower tore into its core. A shockwave rippled outward, disrupting the Dominion's fleet formation as they scrambled to shield the amplifier. "Joran, deploy the drones. Keep their fleet distracted," Darren ordered. Joran moved quickly, launching the reconfigured drones. They streaked across the display, weaving between the Dominion ships and firing in calculated bursts to draw their attention. The Dominion's forces began to fragment, their coordination faltering. "Orlin, redirect the disruptors. Target their command ship," Darren said, his focus unshakable. Orlin's hands flew over his console. "Redirecting power. It's going to take everything we've got." "Do it," Darren said firmly. The ground beneath them rumbled as the surface disruptors came online, their energy arcing upward in brilliant streaks of light. The Dominion's command ship, a hulking monstrosity of alien engineering, bore the full brunt of the attack. Its shields buckled under the relentless assault, explosions rippling across its surface as its systems failed. "They're breaking," Joran said, his voice filled with awe. "We're actually doing it." "Don't stop," Darren replied, his voice hard. "We finish this." The amplifier above Jupiter collapsed in a final, blinding explosion, its psychic network shattering like glass. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, the Dominion's forces suddenly faltering as their coordination dissolved. The command ship, now exposed and vulnerable, was the final blow. "Fire everything," Darren ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The disruptors unleashed their full power, and the command ship erupted in a cascade of light and fire. The explosion lit up the display, the shockwave scattering the remaining Dominion ships. Their fleet, once an unstoppable force, was now in full retreat. The room fell silent as the display cleared, the once menacing red markers dissolving into nothingness. The team stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd achieved sinking in. Darren exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing as the tension bled away. Orlin stepped beside him, his voice quiet but steady. "You actually pulled it off." "Not me," Darren said, his gaze still fixed on the display. "All of us." The relay's glow dimmed as the system stabilized. The fight was over. For now. But as Darren looked at his team, battered and bruised but standing tall, he felt a spark of something deeper: pride, determination. Humanity had faced the unthinkable and won. The Dominion had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Humanity wasn't just immune, they were unstoppable.